The billionaire CEO was on his way to the biggest deal of his life, until he found a crying toddler in his first-class seat, holding a letter with his name on it. Henry Winston moved through the private boarding gate like he had 1,000 times before, efficient, precise, and without emotion. His custom-tailored suit was crisp, his watch synchronized to Tokyo time, and his mind fully absorbed in the negotiation strategy he had mentally rehearsed the entire drive to the airport. This deal would be the biggest of his career. Billions were on the line, not just for the company but for his legacy. Everything had been coordinated to the minute. His assistant had ensured his favorite seat, 13A in first class, was reserved, and his files were loaded onto his tablet, ready for final review during the flight. There was nothing unpredictable about any of it. That was how Henry operated. Control was the foundation of his world. But as he stepped into the cabin and approached row 13, something jolted his routine. His seat was occupied. And not by a fellow executive or a misassigned passenger. A small child, a toddler, maybe 3 years old, was curled up in seat 13A, clutching a stuffed bear and crying softly into the fabric of the seatbelt. He wore a white cotton sweater that looked slightly too big for his tiny frame, and his shoes had clearly been taken off somewhere along the way. His face was flushed from crying, and his wide, tear-filled blue eyes locked onto Henry's with something that made the air catch in Henry's lungs. A flight attendant quickly approached, apologizing with visible confusion. She glanced down at the boy's boarding pass, then back up at Henry. The child's name wasn't listed under any reservation. There was no guardian on the manifest. No check-in alert. No explanation. Yet somehow, this boy had been assigned to seat 13A, Henry's seat. Security was being called. A gate agent was on their way. The captain had been notified. Henry should have been frustrated. He should have insisted on immediate resolution and moved on to another seat, focusing on the billion-dollar deal awaiting him across the ocean. But he didn't. Something stopped him. He didn't understand why, but instead of stepping back, he slowly sat down in seat 13B beside the child, watching him with growing unease. The boy had stopped crying now, but his lips still trembled. Clutched in his hand, almost unnoticed beneath the edge of his sleeve, was a folded piece of paper. A name was scribbled across the front in blue marker, Henry Winston. Henry's chest tightened as he reached out and gently took the letter, unfolding it with growing dread. The handwriting inside was uneven but familiar. He hadn't seen it in years, but he knew it instantly. Eliza. The letter was short, almost rushed, written with a shaking hand. If you're reading this, it means I couldn't go on. I'm sorry. His name is Thomas. He's yours. I had nothing left to give him, but you still have everything. Please don't leave him. For a moment, Henry couldn't process the words. They didn't make sense. Eliza. The woman he had once loved but left behind when ambition took priority. They hadn't spoken in years. She had vanished from his life so completely that sometimes he wondered if she had ever really been in it at all. And now she was reaching out, not for herself, but for a child. His child. He looked back at the boy. Thomas. The resemblance was impossible to ignore now. The shape of his jaw. The curve of his eyebrows. Those bright blue eyes, Henry's mother used to say they were like glass marbles. He had the same. He felt the plane around him fade into the background, the murmurs of confused passengers, the rushed steps of crew members, the mechanical chime of the boarding door. All of it dissolved into a single, undeniable moment. A child had been placed in his seat, with his name on a letter, and no one else in the world coming for him. The flight was grounded. Security needed answers. But Henry wasn't thinking about Tokyo anymore. He was thinking about Eliza, about the choices he'd made, and the boy now resting quietly against the seat with tear stains on his cheeks. This wasn't a mistake. It was a message. A call. A second chance. And for the first time in years, Henry Winston didn't know what happened next. All he knew was that he wasn't getting on that flight. The terminal was quieter than usual once the flight to Tokyo officially closed its doors without him. Henry sat in a glass-walled observation area overlooking the runway, his suit jacket draped over the armrest of a chair that suddenly felt far too stiff. Thomas was asleep beside him, curled up in a fleece blanket one of the attendants had brought earlier, his head resting gently on Henry's lap. Every now and then, his small hand would twitch, fingers grasping for something even in sleep. Henry didn't move. He didn't scroll through his phone. He didn't check emails. All he could do was sit there, unmoving, as the weight of the letter burned in his pocket. The gate agents had done their job. They notified the airline security, called in social services, and double-checked the manifest for any trace of guardianship. Nothing turned up. The name, Eliza Morgan, had triggered a match in the system. She had purchased a ticket under her own name weeks earlier, but never boarded. No luggage. No contact. No one waiting on the other end. She had quite literally disappeared, leaving only the boy, the letter, and a signature that Henry hadn't seen in nearly 4 years. The social worker who arrived didn't recognize him at first. He introduced himself politely, clipboard in hand, prepared to follow procedure. But once he heard Henry's name, something shifted. Everyone knew who Henry Winston was. CEO. Public figure. Fortune covers. Forbes lists. The idea that this child, sitting with tear-dried cheeks and unmatched socks, could be his was not something the system was equipped to handle with quiet efficiency. Henry didn't care about protocol. All he wanted was to understand how it had come to this. How Eliza, independent, proud, complicated Eliza, could leave her son, their son, in an airplane seat with nothing but a note and a hope. And maybe, Henry realized, it wasn't really hope. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was love that had run out of places to go. The social worker explained the next steps. Custodial investigation. Emergency placement. Possible DNA confirmation. Paperwork. Court hearings. Henry nodded, understanding the process but already knowing the outcome. He didn't need a test. He could feel it in his bones, in the curve of the boy's cheek, in the instinct that had taken root the moment Thomas looked up at him. This wasn't a stranger's child. This was his son. And he wasn't going to let him vanish into a system. When Thomas woke up, he didn't cry. He simply sat up slowly, blinking at the bright lights above them, and looked at Henry with a strange sort of stillness. There was no fear in his expression. Just exhaustion and confusion, the kind only children who have lived through too much too soon can carry in their eyes. "Are we going home?" he asked, voice barely louder than a whisper. Henry didn't answer right away. The word home struck something deep in him, something he hadn't felt in years. Home wasn't the penthouse with glass walls and a view of the skyline. It wasn't boardrooms or chauffeurs or curated dinners with investors. Home was wherever Thomas felt safe. And if Henry had any chance of becoming that place, he'd take it. "We're going somewhere safe," he said carefully. "Somewhere just for us." He took Thomas's hand, small, warm, still sticky from the juice box he'd been given earlier, and led him out of the terminal. His driver looked startled when he saw them, but didn't ask questions. Henry gave him a new address, one he hadn't said out loud in years. His mother's old house. It was nestled in a quiet neighborhood an hour outside the city, a place he had visited every summer as a boy before life pulled him into the current of ambition. The house had sat empty since she passed, its windows shuttered and garden overgrown. But it was still standing, still full of echoes, and still waiting. That night, Henry laid Thomas down on the old guest-room bed and sat beside him until his breathing steadied into sleep. He didn't open his laptop. He didn't call Tokyo. He just sat there, watching the boy who had arrived in his life like a storm, quiet on the surface, but deep enough to reshape everything. Outside the window, the wind stirred through the tall grass. Inside, Henry Winston, for the first time in his life, did not feel like a man chasing success. He felt like a man trying to become someone worth coming home to. The days that followed moved with an unfamiliar kind of slowness, as if time itself had paused to make room for something entirely new. Henry woke up early each morning, not to check the markets or prepare for a video conference, but because Thomas was stirring in the next room, murmuring softly in his sleep or padding barefoot across the hardwood floors looking for breakfast. The boy's presence filled the quiet house in a way that unsettled and soothed Henry at once. It had been years since he had lived with anyone else. He was used to silence, to perfect order. But now, every surface was slowly being taken over by scattered toys, stray crumbs, and the warm chaos of a child learning to feel safe. Henry made cereal on the first morning. He poured too much milk, used the wrong kind of spoon, and handed it to Thomas without realizing the bowl was freezing from the fridge. The boy didn't complain. He simply sat at the old wooden table, swinging his legs, and ate quietly, glancing up at Henry now and then as if trying to decide whether he could trust him. Henry sat across from him, still in yesterday's shirt, unsure of what to say or do, except that he couldn't look away. Every movement Thomas made felt surreal. It was like watching a distant memory play out in front of him, familiar, yet painfully new. In the afternoon, Henry took Thomas into town to buy him clothes, something warm, shoes that fit. The boy held his hand without being asked. At the store, the clerk tried to make small talk. "Is this your grandson?" And Henry's response caught even him by surprise. "He's my son." The words felt heavy and strange in his mouth, not because they weren't true, but because he had never said them before. He saw Thomas's face turn slightly toward him at that moment, his eyes widening just a little. The boy didn't speak, but something shifted in the air between them, a thin thread of connection pulling tighter. That evening, after Thomas fell asleep curled up on the couch, Henry walked outside into the cool dusk and sat on the front steps of the house, staring at the overgrown garden. He hadn't been back here in so long. The last time, he had been too busy, too impatient, too distracted by things that now felt embarrassingly hollow. He had missed so much. Not just the years he could have had with Eliza, but the little things, the first smile, the first word, the nights with fevers, the early drawings hung proudly on a wall. He thought about Eliza constantly. What had she gone through? What had driven her to that final decision, to put her son on a plane alone, carrying only a letter and a memory? She had always been strong, sharp, unwilling to be pitted or caged. She had loved fiercely, and he had once believed that would last forever, until he let ambition drown out everything else. Now all he had was the son she left behind, and the guilt that maybe, if he had stayed, things would have been different. But guilt wasn't useful anymore. Thomas didn't need apologies. He needed presence. Stability. Patience. Love. Henry didn't know how to be a father. Not really. But he knew how to stay. And that, he was beginning to realize, was more than enough to start with. The next day, he called the attorney handling the emergency guardianship process. He didn't want temporary custody. He wanted it permanent. He wanted every signature, every form, every evaluation needed to make it official. There were court dates to schedule, documents to file, a DNA test to confirm what his heart already knew. He'd go through all of it. Not out of obligation, but out of choice. A conscious, deliberate choice. When he came home that evening, Thomas ran to him with a drawing clutched in one hand. It was crude, drawn in thick crayon lines, but unmistakable. A tall man holding the hand of a small boy beneath a crooked sun. Above them, in uneven letters, was written one word, Dad. Henry knelt down, took the picture, and looked at Thomas. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just pulled the boy into a gentle hug, not too tight, but close enough to feel how real he was. That night, when the house finally grew quiet, Henry stood by the door of Thomas's room and watched him sleep. He didn't feel lost anymore. He didn't feel unsure. He felt chosen. And that changed everything. By the fourth week, the house no longer felt like a place Henry had returned to, it felt like a place being rewritten, one memory at a time. The silence that once echoed through the halls was now filled with footsteps too small to be heard unless you were listening closely. Thomas had taken to singing softly to himself in the mornings, a series of made-up tunes that always changed but somehow made perfect sense to him. The house, once a monument to a life of order and ambition, now bore signs of imperfection that Henry found strangely comforting: a sock under the coffee table, fingerprints on the glass doors, a crayon drawing stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet that used to hold tax forms. Henry was learning how to adjust, not in grand gestures, but in 100 tiny, humbling ways. He had learned that Thomas hated the smell of eggs and loved apples with the skin peeled. He knew the boy needed 2 stories before bed, no matter how tired he was. He knew Thomas was afraid of loud toilets and that he would only wear pajamas with animals on them. He also knew that the nightmares came twice a week, always just before midnight, and that the boy would call for him softly, unsure if it was okay to wake him. Henry never hesitated. He would come into the room, sit on the edge of the bed, and rub his back until the fear melted away. There were no speeches, no explanations. Just presence. And slowly, that presence was becoming something Thomas could rely on. During the days, Henry began to navigate the unfamiliar world of early childhood. He enrolled Thomas in a local preschool under a temporary guardianship agreement and met with teachers who asked him about routines, favorite toys, food allergies, emotional triggers. He answered as best he could, filled out forms he never imagined completing, and sat through orientation meetings where he was just another parent in a room full of people balancing snacks and toddlers and exhaustion. And surprisingly, he didn't feel out of place. He felt human. Grounded. He had spent years at the top of skyscrapers, giving speeches about vision and strategy, but here, among sticky tables and alphabet charts, he felt closer to something real than he ever had in his glass office. The case with social services moved forward. The DNA test came back, confirmation of paternity, though Henry hadn't needed proof. The official custody process had begun, and while it might take weeks or months to finalize, no one questioned his commitment. The system, cautious as it was, recognized when someone showed up not for obligation but because they refused to leave. Amber, the social worker assigned to their case, was young but sharp, with kind eyes and a steady voice. She visited often to check on Thomas, but also on Henry. She asked about routines, about emotional bonding, about Henry's long-term plans. At first, he gave calculated answers, logical, structured, well-reasoned. But as time passed, his answers changed. He spoke not about plans, but about moments. About how Thomas hugged him tighter every week. About how bedtime had become his favorite part of the day. About how the boy had begun calling him Dad without hesitation. Amber listened, took notes, and once, after a particularly quiet visit, said something that stayed with him: sometimes, love doesn't need a timeline. It just needs proof that you're still there. Henry carried those words with him. They reminded him that he didn't need to be perfect. He just needed to be consistent. When Thomas cried over broken toys, he didn't try to fix them right away. He listened first. When the boy laughed too loudly in restaurants, he didn't hush him. He laughed too. When Thomas asked why his mommy couldn't come back, Henry didn't offer false hope. He held him and told the truth, that she had loved him, that she had done her best, and that now, it was Henry's job to make sure he never had to feel that alone again. One night, after Thomas had fallen asleep with his arms wrapped around a toy firetruck, Henry sat in the living room with a cup of tea, looking through old photos he had dug out of a forgotten box in the attic. Most were of his childhood, his mother, a few blurry shots of Eliza. In one photo, she was sitting in the grass, barefoot, her eyes closed, sunlight on her face. He stared at it for a long time, guilt and love mingling in a way that made his chest ache. He whispered a thank you he knew she would never hear. Not just for Thomas, but for trusting him, even after everything. As the fire crackled and the house settled into night, Henry realized he no longer felt like a man pausing his life for someone else. He wasn't on a break from success. He wasn't waiting to return to what he had lost. He was building something new. Something that didn't need applause, only love. And for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Winter crept in slowly, wrapping the town in early darkness and cold mornings that required extra blankets and gloves too small for Henry to figure out without help. Life had found a rhythm now, and while it was far from easy, it was no longer unfamiliar. Thomas had started calling the house our place, and each time he said it, Henry felt something shift quietly inside him, like the foundation of his life was settling into place for the first time. The days were filled with school drop-offs, grocery runs, bedtime routines, and small miracles, a laugh after a tantrum, a picture drawn with "Dad" written at the top, the soft weight of a child falling asleep against his chest during a movie he hadn't planned to watch. One gray morning, while Henry was helping Thomas zip up his jacket, the doorbell rang. It was unexpected. Very few people knew where they lived now, and Henry had intentionally kept it that way. When he opened the door, he was met with a woman in a long black coat, her expression professional but unreadable. She introduced herself as Rachel Myers, a lawyer representing a man named Curtis, Eliza's former partner, someone Henry had never met but had heard about in vague, uncomfortable tones. Rachel handed Henry an envelope containing legal documents. Curtis was filing a petition. He wanted joint custody of Thomas, claiming he had played a parental role in the boy's early life and had the right to continue doing so. Henry's entire body went still. He thanked her without emotion, closed the door, and locked it behind him, as if that simple gesture could keep the outside world from coming in. He read the documents slowly, twice, then a third time. The words felt sharp and clinical, filled with accusations that boiled down to one thing: doubt. Curtis claimed Henry had no real connection to Thomas, that he had shown up late, that his motivation was rooted in guilt, not love. The petition painted a version of the story Henry didn't recognize, one where he was a stranger to his son, where the bond they had built was nothing more than a temporary solution to a tragic inconvenience. Henry didn't tell Thomas. He didn't know how. The boy was still too young to understand the machinery of the legal system, too young to grasp the idea that someone might try to take him away. But Henry understood. He knew the courts would ask questions. They would examine his life, his decisions, his past. They would look for weakness, for gaps in consistency, for signs that he wasn't ready, that he wasn't enough. The next few days felt heavier. Thomas noticed the tension even if he didn't understand it. He started waking up more at night, asking if Henry would still be there in the morning. He drew pictures with darker colors. His questions became more pointed: why don't I have a mom anymore? Why do other kids have two houses? Henry answered as honestly as he could without unraveling. He told Thomas that not all families looked the same, but that didn't make them any less real. He told him that love was not about matching stories, it was about showing up every day, no matter what. Henry called Amber, the social worker, and they met in the dining room while Thomas was at school. She listened as he explained everything, her brow furrowed, her hands calm around a mug of tea. When he finished, she sighed and said, "Custody battles like this aren't uncommon, but they're always hard. You've done everything right so far, but the courts won't just look at that. They'll look at the past. They'll ask why you weren't there before." Henry nodded. "Because I didn't know. And now that I do, I'm not leaving." Amber didn't smile, but her eyes softened. "Then keep showing them that. Not just the court, Thomas too." With her guidance, Henry gathered everything. Photos. School records. Letters from teachers. Notes from Thomas. Even the drawing that still hung on the refrigerator. He submitted character references. He met with child psychologists. He told his story without embellishment, just truth. The hearing was scheduled for mid-December. As the date approached, Henry found himself slowing down in the evenings. He would sit longer with Thomas after bedtime stories, run his fingers through the boy's hair, and memorize the shape of his breathing. He stopped checking his email entirely. The only schedule he followed was the one that revolved around school lunches and morning hugs. One night, while they sat on the couch watching a holiday cartoon, Thomas looked up and said, "If they make me go away, can I come back anyway?" Henry's heart cracked clean down the middle. He took the boy into his arms, held him tight, and whispered, "No one is taking you away. Not while I'm here." And he meant it. Every word. Because love, Henry had come to learn, was not always enough to stop pain. But it was enough to stand in front of it, hold the line, and refuse to let it win. The courthouse was gray and quiet on the morning of the hearing. Snow had started falling just before dawn, blanketing the streets in a thin, untouched layer that seemed to slow everything down. Henry arrived early, dressed in a dark suit that felt heavier than it used to, not because of the fabric, but because of the weight of everything it represented now. He wasn't here as a CEO or a public figure. He was here as a father, one who had spent every day for the last 2 months building something out of nothing, learning how to love a child who had been a stranger to him, and trying to become someone that child could count on without question. Amber met him at the entrance. She had a folder tucked under one arm and a tired but reassuring look in her eyes. They walked through the halls together in silence until they reached the family courtroom, a modest space with worn benches and soft lighting that felt more like a waiting room than a battlefield. On the far side of the room sat Curtis, the man who had filed the petition. He was taller than Henry expected, dressed well, his expression unreadable. He didn't acknowledge Henry. He just sat beside his lawyer, hands clasped tightly in front of him. The judge entered shortly after and asked for both sides to present their cases. Curtis's lawyer went first, reading from a prepared statement filled with vague but pointed claims. He painted Curtis as a long-time emotional presence in Thomas's life, someone who had stepped in when no one else did. He spoke of Eliza with respect, but also as someone overwhelmed by her circumstances. He implied that Henry had stepped in only when things became convenient and that his relationship with Thomas, though well-meaning, lacked foundation. Henry listened without interrupting. He didn't flinch when the lawyer described him as emotionally unavailable, or when he questioned the sincerity of Henry's motives. He had prepared for this. He had expected it. And when it was his turn to speak, he didn't read from a statement. He stood, looked directly at the judge, and spoke from the place where all of this had begun. He told the truth. He told them how he hadn't known Thomas existed until the moment he saw him on that plane. How the boy had been left with nothing but a note and his name. How he had taken him home not out of guilt or responsibility, but out of something deeper, something he didn't have words for then but understood now, instinct, connection, the overwhelming feeling that this child belonged to him, not because of blood, but because of the bond that had formed in the weeks since. He talked about bedtime routines and scraped knees, about early mornings filled with cereal and coloring books, about the way Thomas had started calling him Dad without ever being asked to. He didn't cry, though his voice caught once, when he said, "This isn't something I'm doing for Thomas. This is something we're building together. Every single day. He's not my obligation. He's my son." After his testimony, Amber presented her report. She spoke of Thomas's progress, of the emotional stability he had gained, of the strength of the relationship she had observed between them. She referenced the letters from Thomas's teachers, the consistent involvement in his life, and the way Henry had chosen to change the course of his entire world just to stay close to one little boy. The psychologist echoed her report, noting that removing Thomas from Henry's care at this stage would likely cause more harm than any possible benefit. The judge asked a few final questions, then called a short recess. Henry stepped outside into the hallway, leaning against the wall near a vending machine that flickered weakly in the corner. He felt empty, not from fatigue, but from the emotional cost of having to prove something he already knew in his bones. He wanted to be back home. He wanted to pick up Thomas from school and take him to the park and read him the same story 3 times in a row just because he asked. He didn't want to fight anymore. He just wanted to live. When the court reconvened, the judge returned with her ruling. Her tone was measured, but her words were clear. Curtis's petition was denied. Legal custody would remain with Henry, and the court recognized him as the primary guardian with full parental rights. There was no applause. No dramatic moment of celebration. Just quiet stillness and the sound of Henry releasing a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Later that day, when he picked Thomas up from school, the boy ran toward him with the same unfiltered joy he always had. Henry knelt, caught him mid-run, and held him close, letting the cold air sting his eyes for a moment longer than necessary. He didn't explain what had happened in court. He didn't need to. He simply said, "Let's go home." And Thomas, smiling wide and warm against his shoulder, whispered back, "Our home." That was all that mattered. The weeks that followed the custody ruling felt like stepping into a new season of life, one Henry hadn't known he was waiting for. The tension that had quietly lived beneath the surface of every moment was finally gone. No more court dates. No more paperwork. No more watching every move with the fear that someone would question whether he belonged in his son's life. What remained was routine, not the kind dictated by business calendars and global meetings, but the kind made up of school pickups, spilled juice, bedtime laughter, and tiny socks that never stayed in pairs no matter how often he tried to organize them. Thomas had begun to change too. The fear in his eyes, the caution in his tone, the slight flinch when someone raised their voice, all of it began to fade. He smiled more, talked more, asked more questions. He had started drawing daily, pictures of their house, of the two of them holding hands, of rockets and dogs and sometimes things he couldn't explain but always called ours. Henry kept every one, taping them to the walls, the fridge, even the mirror in the hallway, until their home felt less like a restored memory and more like a living scrapbook of a boy reclaiming his childhood. Amber visited one last time for a final check-in. She walked through the house slowly, noting how Thomas clung to Henry's leg in a playful way, how naturally he moved through the space, how he pointed to his own room as "my spot" with a pride that was impossible to fake. She sat down with Henry in the kitchen after Thomas had gone outside to chase leaves in the wind and told him simply, "You did it." Not because the court said so, but because he did. He trusts you. And that's all the proof that ever mattered. Henry didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to praise that felt so personal. But Amber wasn't the type to linger. She left him with a signed document and a smile that didn't need words. That night, Henry made spaghetti from scratch for the first time. It was messy, wildly uneven, and Thomas declared it, kinda weird but still yummy. They ate sitting on the floor of the living room because the table was covered in Lego creations they had both agreed were too important to move. After dinner, they built a blanket fort. It wasn't very sturdy, and Henry bumped his head twice, but they read books inside it until Thomas fell asleep against his chest, breathing softly, fingers still tangled in the edge of Henry's shirt like a child who finally knew he was safe. In the quiet of that moment, Henry looked around at the chaos of pillows, books, and mismatched blankets, and realized he no longer missed the skyline view from his penthouse. He no longer felt the urge to check stock reports or performance projections. He didn't crave the approval of investors or the thrill of closing another impossible deal. He had traded all of that for something far simpler and infinitely more profound, a life made up of presence, of shared moments, of unconditional love offered without expectation. He thought of Eliza more gently now. Not with guilt, but with gratitude. She had made the hardest decision of her life to ensure that Thomas had a chance. And somewhere deep in his bones, Henry believed she would have been proud of how it turned out. Not because he had done everything right, but because he hadn't run. Because he had stayed. As winter melted into early spring, Henry and Thomas began walking to school instead of driving. They talked about everything and nothing, about frogs and clouds and whether cereal should be cold or hot. On weekends, they worked on the backyard together, planting tiny seedlings that Thomas insisted would grow into trees taller than the house. Henry didn't argue. He let the boy believe in magic because, for the first time in his life, he kind of believed in it too. He was still learning how to be a father. There were mistakes, impatience, moments when he questioned himself. But there was no more doubt about whether he belonged in this life. He did. And every day, Thomas showed him that being a parent wasn't about doing it all perfectly. It was about being the one who stays, who listens, who shows up again and again. And Henry, a man who had once built towers out of steel and glass, was now building something even stronger, one bedtime story, one school project, one whispered, "I love you," at a time. Spring arrived quietly, with rain that soaked the streets and small bursts of green pushing up through the earth like promises. The world outside was waking up again, but inside Henry's home, it felt like something had already bloomed. There was a calmness in the way the mornings began now, a rhythm to the life they'd created that no longer felt temporary or fragile. It was real. Thomas had stopped asking questions like, "Will I stay here?" or "Are you leaving?" Instead, he talked about summer plans and whether they could build a treehouse, if maybe they could get a dog, and if Henry would come to his school talent show even if he didn't win anything. Henry said yes to all of it. They no longer needed the nightlight. Thomas no longer needed the lullabies whispered at midnight to fall back asleep. But sometimes, Henry still sat beside his bed, not because the boy needed it, but because he did. He had once feared he wouldn't know how to love someone unconditionally, that the years he had spent living for ambition had made him too hard, too distant, too unfit for something as soft and pure as fatherhood. But now, as he watched Thomas grow, taller, more confident, filled with opinions and imagination, he understood that love had reshaped him entirely. It had reached places no success ever could. One Saturday afternoon, Henry received a letter in the mail, one that caught him off guard. It was handwritten, postmarked from a small town he didn't recognize. Inside was a note from Eliza's sister, someone he had never met. The letter wasn't long. It simply said, "I don't know what happened between you and Eliza. She never talked much about the past. But I do know she loved that boy more than anything, and that she made the hardest choice a mother ever could. I think she'd want you to know that she hoped you'd find each other. Thank you for not turning away." Henry sat with that letter for a long time. He hadn't realized how much he needed that small piece of grace, from someone who had known Eliza when he hadn't. It didn't change what had happened, and it didn't ease the ache that sometimes still settled in his chest when he thought of her. But it gave him something else, closure, or at least a kind of peace. Later that day, Thomas found him sitting alone in the kitchen, the letter folded on the table. The boy climbed into his lap and, without asking what was wrong, wrapped his arms around Henry's neck. They stayed like that for a while. No questions, no explanations. Just a father and a son, holding each other in the quiet certainty that they had found exactly where they belonged. That evening, Henry cooked dinner, nothing fancy, just grilled cheese and tomato soup, Thomas's favorite. They ate on the porch, watching the rain taper off into a light drizzle. Thomas asked if they could go somewhere together in the summer, maybe a beach or a mountain or even just a cabin in the woods. He didn't care where, as long as it was with Henry. And Henry promised they would, that they'd go anywhere he wanted. It wasn't about the destination. It was about the time. Before bed, Thomas handed Henry a new drawing. This one had more detail than usual, trees, a swing, a little red house with a sun above it. Two figures stood in front, one tall, one small. Both smiling. Above them, in blocky crayon letters, were the words, "Our beginning." Henry hung it next to the others. He no longer thought about the life he used to live, not with longing, not even with regret. That life had ended the moment he saw a crying child in seat 13A, holding a letter with his name on it. Everything that came after that wasn't a detour. It was the real path, the one he hadn't known existed. Now, he didn't wake up chasing deadlines. He woke up to little feet on the stairs, to sleepy voices asking for pancakes, to a life that was quieter, smaller, but infinitely more full. He had once believed that his legacy would be the buildings he left behind, the empire he built from nothing. But as he stood in Thomas's doorway that night, watching the boy drift to sleep with peace on his face and crayons still scattered across the bed, he realized that this was the only legacy that mattered. And in the deepest part of him, Henry knew he hadn't just saved Thomas. Thomas had saved him too. What makes the ending of this story so powerful is how quietly it speaks. It doesn't need a grand twist or a dramatic climax, because the real transformation happens slowly, through presence, patience, and love. Henry's journey from detached executive to devoted father is not only believable, it's deeply moving. It shows that healing doesn't come from fixing the past, but from choosing to show up fully in the present. The most touching part, for me, is how the story honors both the child's innocence and the adult's capacity for change. Thomas isn't just a symbol of redemption, he's a whole person who teaches Henry how to be human again. And Henry, despite his flaws and late start, earns something money could never buy: trust, connection, and the right to be called Dad. It's a reminder that the most meaningful legacies aren't built in boardrooms or measured in billions. They're built in bedtime stories, kitchen table drawings, and the quiet promise to never walk away.